Okay, so we are live. Hey everybody, if you are on with us already, my name is Tom Momberg, and I am a member of the board of the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis. And we are very pleased and really privileged to have a guest with us this evening, uh, Otis Sanford, who is going to speak to us, for starters at least, about Ida B. Wells and the Ida B. Wells events that led up to the dedication of the new statue a couple of Fridays ago here in Memphis. And our regular guest, Laura Cabetta, is also on. And hey, Laura. And Laura is also, along with me, a member of the board of the Lynching Sites Project. And she is going to be our primary host for the evening, and will be in conversation with Otis for most of the time this evening. So we look forward to having two journalists have a conversation, a mutual conversation about their work and how issues of racial justice and healing are part of that work. So I think what I'd like to do to begin is to just say that the mission of the Lynching Sites Project, this is something you can find on our website, Lynching Sites, S-I-T-E-S, Lynching Sites Mem. So that's one word, lynchingsitesmem.org. But the mission of the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis is to collaborate with others to cultivate courageous conversations and programs like this one that uncover the whole truth, or at least as much of the whole truth as can be uncovered, of racial terror and violence, and then to change the narrative in Shelby County, leading to understanding, compassion, and healing while we work together toward racial equality and justice. And so this evening, as I was saying a few minutes ago, we have the pleasure and the privilege of having Otis Sanford with us. And if you are on with us this evening, you probably got an email and got a link to be on with us this evening. And in that email, you might have already read, but I do want to speak these words as a way of kind of a general introduction or reintroduction for Mr. Sanford. Otis Sanford, in addition to writing regular columns, first for the Commercial Appeal for many years, and now with the Daily Memphian, he holds the Hardin Chair of Excellence in Journalism and Strategic Media at the University of Memphis. And he is the political analyst and commentator for WATN Local 24. He also was part of a recent PBS special called Ida B. Wells, The Advocate. So we are honored to have Otis Sanford in our midst. And Otis, there's one thing that I wanted to read also to folks from this book that you and one of your colleagues, Dan Conaway, got published not long ago. And this is from the foreword of the book. It's called In a Colorful Place, Seasoned Opinion. I love that phrase, seasoned opinion
that
about
just means
Memphis.
We're old.
Yeah, I often use that expression, seasoned veteran. Seasoned opinion about Memphis, home, and life. But here's a few words about Otis in the foreword that Eric Barnes, the CEO of the Daily Memphian, wrote. And he's talking about Otis's love for Memphis. And what he says is, even in his columns that are critical of some or another thing that is happening in Memphis, there's never any cynicism. There's skepticism sometimes, which is healthy. And there's criticism sometimes, which is healthy too. Criticism and skepticism are, I believe, essential to good journalism. So that's my way of saying, Otis, welcome. And we would love to hear from you from both your journalistic and your personal perspective about how we have now honored Ida B. Wells here in Memphis.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Laura and with Jessica as well. And so I want to thank you for inviting me. Happy to be
You're
here.
welcome.
Let me start, and I want to be fairly brief with my remarks because I want to have a conversation more than a lecture or a talk along that line. But let me start by giving a frame of reference here about myself. My background is one of having grown up on a farm in Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s. So if you can picture, even if you're too young to know what the 1950s and even the 60s were, just sort of imagine what that was like for someone who looks like me. And it was no piece of cake, especially from a cultural and certainly from a racial background. I grew up in segregation. I grew up in racist Mississippi in the 50s and 60s. I attended segregated schools all the way to the 12th grade. That was my senior year, was the first year of full racial integration in Mississippi, and that was 16 years after Brown versus Board of Education, which meant that the state of Mississippi basically just said, we're not paying any attention to what the justices said. This is what Dr. King talked about when he talked about nullification. They just nullified what the Supreme Court said back in 1954, and that lasted until 1970. And so as a result of that, even though I was in an all-Black school, I didn't learn a lot about Ida B. Wells in elementary school. And that, I think mostly that was because the teachers pretty much stuck to the history books that they were given. And they were hand-me-down history books, I might add. And there was nothing in there about Ida B. Wells. I don't remember anything in there about Ida B. Wells, even though I studied Mississippi history, I believe in the 5th grade. And Ida B. Wells is from Mississippi, Holly Springs, not far from my hometown in Colmmunity, only about 40 miles or so. But I never heard much about her, only until I got to early high school and expressed an interest in journalism. And we had a teacher. He wasn't a journalist by trade. He was an English teacher, but they told him, well, you take the journalism and be the advisor for the newspaper. And thankfully, this segregated school had a campus newspaper. It didn't come out all that regularly, but it came out occasionally. And I became interested in journalism as a result of that. And that's where I first learned about Ida B. Wells, from my high school journalism teacher. And I was fascinated by what I learned. And later on, as someone who became really enthralled with history itself, I'm a lover of history. I did independent research on her. And again, what she did, what she accomplished, what she went through during her life, especially the relatively short time she was in Memphis, I think only about 7 or so years. But she was a courageous individual who stood for truth and who stood for justice. And so, as I said, I didn't learn much about her in school, just as I didn't learn about other African Americans who had accomplished politically in the state of Mississippi, including the very first African American senator ever in Mississippi. Came from Mississippi, a guy named Hiram Revels. You don't hear much about him. Or the second one was a guy named Blanche Bruce, and Blanche is a male. You don't hear much about these folks. Even today, you don't hear a lot about them. But they were trailblazing African Americans who served in those two served in the US Senate. And so when we talk about the events of 2 weeks ago, the whole week devoted to remembering and honoring Ida B. Wells, it was certainly long overdue, but I think it came at the right time, because now we can understand and put in perspective just what Ida B. Wells went through. And I tip my hat really to the committee that started this process some 2 years ago. I was talking with Elder Simba Gray, Reverend Gray, earlier today about it, because I wanted to tell him just how appreciative I am that he was willing to take on this project. And it's been a 2-year project just to get the statue and the beginnings of the plaza done, but it's not over yet. They have some other things that they plan to put there. And it's a very appropriate place. The statue of Ida B. Wells is majestic to me. She is standing in a pose that is dignified. And as she is looking, if you go and look at the statue, she is actually, it's right next to First Baptist Beale Street Church, but she's not looking at Beale Street. They have the statue of her looking sort of northwest. And I imagine her looking north and west downtown at the halls of government, at City Hall, at the County Administration Building, at the Criminal Justice Center. That's how I vision her looking when I look at that statue now. And those were the things that she confronted in her life, because she confronted so-called justice in Memphis. And she confronted the politicians, and she served the business community, the traditional white business community of this city, that not only looked the other way at the lynchings and things that were going on here, but pretty much encouraged it as well. And I also think about the white-owned newspapers at that time and how she raised the ire of them, including the newspaper that I worked for 26 years. I worked for the Commercial Appeal and was managing editor of the Commercial Appeal and opinion editor. That's when I started writing the column that you mentioned. And when you look back at what Ida B. Wells was doing in the early 1890s, challenging the lynchings that were going on here and in the South, and she drew the ire of the editor of the Memphis Commercial, which became the Commercial Appeal, Edward Carmack, and how he called for her to be killed. Didn't even know who she was, but called for her to be killed. And that was part of the whipping up of the white mobs in Memphis that led to her newspaper there on Beale Street being burned while she was out of town, and she never came back to town as a result of that. You have to look at the role that the newspapers played in that. So that is an example of the good and the bad of journalism back then. Hers was the good part. She was a truth teller. She was an in-your-face journalist. Edward Carmack was a racist, plain and simple. And he, his newspaper knew about the planned lynching of the three friends of Ida B. Wells, the owners of the People's Grocery, his newspaper reporter there knew about it because he was tipped off and he was there when it happened and covered it and wrote about it in the paper the next day. But they never did anything to try to stop any of that. So when I went down and looked at that statue, and I can't help but thank God really for Ida B. Wells. I posted something on Facebook that says, I stand on the shoulders of Ida B. Wells because I wouldn't be where I have been in journalism if it had not been for an Ida B. Wells. Her life is extraordinary. And the fact that she was born only about 40 miles from where I was born, just in different eras. But I have a kinship of sorts with Ida B. Wells. And so she is my heroine. And I just, I'm really appreciative of what the committee, this Memphis Memorial Committee did. The fact that the city was agreeable to help with this, with the land there right at that corner of Beale and 4th. I predict that this will be a major tourist attraction for the city from now on, because it's just that special. And I plan to go there as many times as I possibly can, especially when I'm in need of some inspiration to continue to do what I do in journalism. I'll look to Ida B. Wells for that inspiration. And so I'll be there sitting on the benches in the Ida B. Wells Plaza, thinking to myself, what would Ida B. Wells do? That's how much I'm appreciative of having that plaza there. So that's my thoughts about the importance of it. And every Memphian, no matter what race, creed, or color you are, you should appreciate what was done there at that corner to bring someone who I think to some degree had been forgotten a little bit in history, bring that story and that legacy back to life. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say those words, Tom.
Otis, thank you so much for framing that the way you have, to talk about your own story and the importance of Ida B. Wells in your own life as both someone who inspired you professionally, but also personally. And I'm really happy to hear you use the word legacy, because that's something that's really become a focus for me as someone who has moved into the second half of life and who wonders, what is my legacy? And I know that a big piece of my legacy is the work that I have been inspired to do by people like Ida B. Wells, frankly, Otis, by people like you as well, and by my colleagues in the Lynching Sites Project, so that I can continue to ask myself the question, not just what would Ida B. Wells do, but what would a white guy like me, who does not want to be racist in any way, what would I do differently? I think that there are a lot of phrases and words that are difficult to use these days because they've been hijacked, perhaps. And one of those phrases or words is anti-racist. And one of the other ways I think about the work I'm trying to do is that, and I'm going to borrow the language of recovery here. I believe that I'm a recovering racist, which means that I will always have a tendency to be racist. It's about recovering the healing and the justice part within me in those around me that allows me to do the work that I want to be part of my legacy. So, and I guess the other thing I want to say is I was at that dedication 2 Fridays ago, and there were so many people there, hundreds of people there, so inspiring. And yet it's important for me to do what you just said you've done, is to go back and just be in that plaza and look at that statue and be inspired by what is now going to be, I think you're right, Otis, an attraction for Memphis, to bring people here for all kinds of reasons, in addition to the ones they already know. Perhaps they'll get to Memphis, not know about the Ida B. Wells Plaza, and discover it and be able to tell others when they go home, kind of thing. So thank you for that great introduction. And speaking of introductions, I want to give a better introduction for Laura Cabetta, my colleague on the board of the Lynching Sites Project. We're happy to have Laura with us again. She's become kind of our primary interviewer and colleague in conversation lately, and that's great. Laura is fairly new to the board, and we are thrilled to have her on the board with us. She's a journalist, and she is an emerging public historian. Her focus is primarily on translating how history connects to the present and how we can use lessons from the past to create a better future. She's a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And she, like I said, she joined the Lynching Sites Project board just last year. So Laura, welcome back. And I can't wait to hear the two of you talk about standing on the shoulders of Ida B. Wells and anything else you want to talk about. Take it away, Laura.
Same here. Thanks, Tom. Just one quick housekeeping item. We're going to have a Q&A portion at the end of this conversation. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, folks, and we will get to them eventually, as many as we can in the time that we have. Otis, some of the things that stood out to me when you were sharing was about there's a lot of similarities and differences with your story that I resonated with. So I grew up in the 90s as opposed to the 50s and 60s and in a integrated school, but integrated is a light term, I would say, where I was often the only person, usually Black person, in my classes. But the similarities that I heard was the delay in education about important figures like Ida B. Wells. The first time I heard her name was when I was in college. It was not a subject that came up anytime during my time in high school or anything like that. And I grew up in Virginia, in between DC and Richmond, which was, the two capitals of the Civil War. So smack in the middle was a lot of battles that happened there. And a lot of, I think part of that came from the desire to sugarcoat a lot of that history, because our town was such in the thick of it for so long. And I definitely want to talk about that later on, of just how we get introduced and sometimes blocked from the truth in education. And then also about the celebrations a couple of weeks ago. While I was there, as a journalist, I just tend to find the other journalists in the space, and was talking to Bill Dries at the Daily Memphian. He had also covered the unveiling of the marker downtown to Ida B. Wells back in the 80s, which two Lynching Sites Project folks, Al Mella and Pan, were a part of putting that together. And he commented on how the crowd size was very different. In that first unveiling, it was very small. There weren't a lot of folks there. And comparing that to, a couple of weeks ago was really remarkable to see, or at least from how he was describing it. I was imagining it and got really excited of just how much she's becoming more a part of the American consciousness, which is really exciting.
Right.
But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on kind of what stood out to you in those conversations or in the celebrations a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I think, again, I think you just hit on it, and I touched on it earlier, just the broad range of people who were there. I remember when I didn't cover it, I don't think. I was a reporter back in the early 80s. I think when the Ida B. Wells marker was put up, I didn't cover it. And Bill Dries is correct. I'm sure that was a very small group that was there. And probably all African Americans, I would imagine. Maybe not, but it probably was. And this time around, it was markedly different. And it was different because people have started to appreciate just what Ida B. Wells did and what she meant. And that's national, not just here in Memphis. I mean, the fact that she won a Pulitzer Prize, a posthumous Pulitzer Prize, is another thing. Also, the fact that there have been at least 2, I think 3 documentaries on her life recently. I was a part of one that the PBS station in Chicago did. That was aired, actually was aired here in Memphis the weekend of the statue unveiling on WKNO. That made her a national figure to a brand new audience. And so you have and plus the confluence, and I know you will appreciate this, Laura, the confluence now of protest and standing up and taking to the streets to fight for rights in the 21st century. You know, I call it the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor effect, where people have said enough is enough. And even that Ida B. Wells special at the very end, it talked about activism today and how young women, especially young women of color, were pretty much leading the activism that is going on today to fight for justice and against racism, against police brutality, against all the things that Ida B. Wells was fighting for and against more than 120 years ago, 130 years ago here in Memphis. And so that's what I saw when I saw that crowd out there at the plaza that day. I saw people finally recognizing just what a phenomenal woman Ida B. Wells was. And they're being introduced to her story, especially the young people in there. They're being introduced to her story, some for the very first time. And when they overlay her story onto what the story is today, with people fighting for just equal rights, fighting against racism, fighting against just the teaching of systemic racism in public schools. I think it makes people appreciate Ida B. Wells even more. And so that's what I think about when I think about that multicultural, multiracial crowd that packed into the plaza and around the plaza 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's really good. And there's so many aspects of her story that, not only did she start as a teacher, she was a journalist, she was a public speaker, international public speaker against lynching, women's suffragists, just the list goes on. She was a probation officer at one point, just all these things. And I was curious when you were part of the documentary, if there was something that even you learned new about Ida B. Wells's story that, maybe people don't know.
Well, yes, there's quite a bit, as a matter of fact. And I really, I was proud to be on there with people like Nicole Hannah Jones, who used to be with the New York Times magazine, Michelle Duster, the great granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, Daphne McFerrin from here in Memphis at the Ben Hooks Institute. All of them were a part of it as well. There were two things that I didn't know that I learned. One of them was even before the lynching at the Curve, she fought back against segregation on a train. I didn't know that story. If I did, I'd forgotten it. And the fact that she was, pretty much manhandled and kicked off of one of the, upscale cars on a train and put back in the smoking car. And she took the railroad company to court over that and won at the lower court level. I did not know that story. And also the fact that when she was a teacher, she took on her own employer, the Memphis schools, about substandard facilities for Black kids in the schools. So I didn't know those two things about her. And what I saw when I looked at the whole documentary, not just my parts of it, I appreciated her even more because she was not a person that was willing to just lay down and take whatever people were going to dish out to her. She fought for her rights. She fought for the rights of others. And she was an outstanding journalist who, when she, after the deaths of her friends at the People's Grocery, she went around the South and did unbelievable research, even kept a ledger of the lynchings. Once she discovered that the lynchings were not about Black men attacking and sexually assaulting white women, lynchings for the most part was just about, it could be about anything. In the People's Grocery case, it was just about, having the nerve to compete against a white store owner in the neighborhood. And there were others that, just whatever, you make up a reason to kill a Black person and then say he was assaulting a white woman. I mean, look at Emmett Till. I mean, that's a prime example. So those are the 2 to 3 things that I learned about Ida B. Wells that I did not know and made me appreciate her even more.
Yeah, and for those that want to watch it, I recently watched it online. It's available. You don't have to, tune in, but it's the Chicago PBS station. It's about an hour long, and was really, really informative.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and the story about her getting kicked off the train and suing the train company. She was in her early 20s at the time. In an era where she didn't have the backing of the NAACP because it hadn't been created yet.
That's right.
It was Ida versus the world.
Exactly. I mean, she helped create the NAACP. That's another thing about it.
Mm-hmm. And just how much of that was just from her own kind of moral compass of this is wrong and I need to do something about it.
Exactly.
Was really amazing.
Exactly.
And where do you see her legacy playing out today? We talked a little bit about activism, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how it plays out in other arenas, like whether it be journalism or other areas.
Well, I think let's start with journalism. I think that her legacy is going to just continue to grow in the field of journalism. Most people in journalism, especially people of color, will say, "Yeah, I know about Ida B. Wells. We honor Ida B. Wells at the National Association of Black Journalists, and they do." But the fact that she was finally awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize, that puts her on a different level. And I think that young journalists of color will be looking at her even more for inspiration about doing the job of journalism. I don't have to tell you, Laura, journalism is not an easy thing to do. It is time consuming. It can be frustrating at times. There are times when you don't get the story. There are times when you are trying to make a difference and you really don't make a difference. And there are even times sometimes when you get things wrong. So you have to put up with all of that. But all of us need to draw inspiration from somewhere and in this job. You either have a mentor who helped you along the way, or you get a break here and there, or you have an advisor, or maybe it's a professor at the university that helped you and counseled you. Well, even though she's been dead since the 1930s, Ida B. Wells is still an inspiration for a lot of people, not just journalists of color, but all journalists who are interested in doing the job that most journalists say they want to do, which is make a difference, speak for those who don't have a voice, which, trying to give power to the powerless sometimes, and holding people accountable. That's what we do in journalism. We try to hold those in power accountable. I tell my students all the time, one of the mantras that I live by is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And Ida B. Wells is a personification of that. I mean, she definitely afflicted the comfortable. I mean, because she talked about things that really raised the ire of people in her day, to the point where they were willing to commit violence. And she obviously was good at writing because people got so irate about it. If she wasn't a good writer, people would have just ignored it. But she pierced the inner soul of people with how she wrote. And that is an inspiration for journalists today. I mean, you don't have to go out and say, I'm going to get the bad guys and put them in jail. That's going to be my call. You don't have to do all of that, although it's fine if you do. But just make a difference in whatever journalism you're trying to do. I mean, even if it's food writing, and I love food writers because they are some good writers, and we have a couple of good ones here in the city of Memphis. You can make a difference there, or you can make a difference just covering the school system, which I think you had done for a while. Whatever you do, just make a difference. Try to improve conditions in whatever surrounding you're in. That is the legacy, and that's what young journalists today should be striving for. And they should be looking at Ida B. Wells as a model for that.
And one thing that I think folks would be interested in hearing too, which is kind of a little bit of inside baseball, but I think it really affects public discourse and how journalists kind of debate this when it comes to how do we define objectivity and seeking truth. Because Ida B. Wells, I think, is a really great example of someone who used facts. She was accurate. She wasn't trying to obscure the truth. She was trying to tell the truth. But at the same time, she was also doing public speaking engagements with a stance. It wasn't neutral, but it was the truth, if that makes sense. And so
Right.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And I think other people might be interested in hearing that.
Well, that's fairly easy for me these days, Laura, because I am an opinion journalist.
Right.
And I have been that. I spent the first, I don't know how many years of my journalism career, well, from 1975 to 2008, 7. I considered myself to just be an objective journalist. As a reporter, I just covered the story. I didn't put my opinions in the stories, and I just covered the facts and tried to get at the truth as much as I could. Same thing as an editor. I was an editor for many years, and I insisted that my reporters, seek the truth and report it. As an opinion journalist, you still You're still doing the reporting. You're still trying to get at the truth. But you can bring your point of view into it. That's what opinion journalism is all about. And there are some stories that there are no two sides to the story. It's either right or it's wrong. Now, I didn't make up that. That actually came from someone in a book that a good friend of mine, who is a professor over at Ole Miss, who wrote about the reporters who covered the integration of Ole Miss when James Meredith came over there. And it's a fabulous book. The title, I think, is "We Thought We Were Immortal." I think that's the name of it. But it was a journalist in that book that said sometimes there are no two sides to the story. It's either right or it's wrong. And I think Ida B. Wells felt that way. There's no two sides to what happened to Mr. Stewart and the others who were lynched, owners of the People's Grocery. There's no two sides to that. You killed them for no reason. And then there are some columns that I write for the Daily Memphian. I'm not interested in the other side of wrong. If the other side is wrong, no, I'm not interested in that. So I guess what I'm saying here is that journalism is about getting at the truth. And sometimes, well, most of the time, when you're doing opinion journalism, the truth is all that matters. Now, I will give the other side their say, but then I'll come right back and say that makes no sense. I did that just this past week in a column about taking down the Nathan Bedford Forrest bust out of the Tennessee State Capitol. I had been advocating for that for a long time. And, you know, for the people who say that Nathan Bedford Forrest had a change of heart in the waning years of his life, well, you don't give me much evidence to show that he did, because all the research I show say that, yes, he went to speak to a Black group, but what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. And when a white politician from one of the rural counties in Tennessee wrote in an op-ed piece 3 or 4 years ago that Nathan Bedford Forrest very well was the first civil rights leader, I call that ludicrous. It makes no sense. So I'm not going to give credence to something like that. So that's what I mean when I say it's easy for me as an opinion journalist. I report the facts, I report the truth, but I call it as I see it. And if it's ludicrous, I'm going to say it's ludicrous.
Well, and surely that comes up with your students too, who might not all be opinion journalists in the future. So how do you approach that kind of in the non-opinion, realm? Well,
yeah, I mean, for my students, if I'm teaching a news writing class, just a straight news writing class, oh yes, I tell them, keep your opinions out of the story. I'm not interested in your opinions. I want you to cover the facts. And get the story and get as many. Sometimes there's more than two sides. Get all the sides. Do a thorough job of reporting and let the truth and let the facts dictate how the story is done. Leaving your opinion out of it. Oh yes, absolutely. I don't want my students doing that. But I do teach a class at the University of Memphis for seniors mostly, and some grad students. It is a class on opinion writing and reporting, because I want them, if they're ever interested in doing opinion journalism, whether it's on broadcast or whether it's in print, I want you to know how to do it the right way. And you still have to bring your journalistic skills around reporting and accuracy and seeking the truth. You have to bring all of that to that job. So I do teach upper level students how to do appropriate opinion journalism. I think you can teach that at the college level and not have them go off and make everything that they do opinion journalism. I think you can do that.
What would you say, kind of bringing it more local, what would you say from your observations of journalism in Memphis that would need to kind of change to more reflect Ida B. Wells's legacy?
Well, I mean, honestly, I am very bullish, if that's the right word, on local journalism in Memphis right now. I think we have good journalism going on in the city in a lot of different places right now. Now, not everybody will know all of the places, but there is some very good investigative public service journalism that's going on in this community. It's even the commercial appeal, which I was down on a few years ago because I thought that the new owners had just sort of abandoned Memphis and had cut the staff, and we were not getting anything out of them. They have upped their game quite a bit, and they are doing some quality journalism there. But obviously, the Daily Memphian is one of the newest kid on the block, with some talented writers and reporters, and they are doing good quality work. MLK 50 is probably one of the closest ones to actually sort of representing Ida B. Wells's legacy, because what they are doing over there, led by Wendy Thomas, is really holding those in authority accountable. And she's had some tremendous impact, especially with the business community and with the criminal justice community, and with the medical community, for example, by shining a light on how they were going after indigent patients who couldn't pay their bills. That to me was really in the spirit of Ida B. Wells. You have the Institute for Public Service Reporting that's going on at the University of Memphis with David Waters, who Tom mentioned earlier. David and Mark Pereskia, who is clearly the most experienced investigative reporter in Memphis, they are continuing to do great investigative journalism there. And you have, the Tri-State Defender with veteran journalists over there who are doing great work, and the Flyer and the Business Journal. I mean, there is just so much good journalism going on right now in Memphis that some people may not know about. That's why I'm encouraging people, even on this call, to, if you're only reading the Commercial Appeal or the Daily Memphian, you need to broaden your horizon a little bit here and check out what all of these other local news organizations are doing, because they are doing some really good work, holding people's feet to the fire, doing accountability journalism, public service journalism, giving voice to those who have no voice. That's a lot of that going on around here right now.
Yeah, those are all really great examples.
And don't let me leave out Chalkbeat, because Chalkbeat is doing it as well. I rely on Chalkbeat a lot for, I do television commentary, and, I can't be every place. And so I rely on these others to form my opinions on journalism, on television. And I use Chalkbeat and all the other organizations to help me try to frame my thoughts about what should be said from a commentary point of view.
Yeah, and that's really what the best journalism does, is that it provides information and true information to help people make their own decisions about,
right.
Now that we know, what do we do?
What are you going to do about it? That's exactly
right. Yeah. And we mentioned that we wanted to also bring up your recent column about Ida B. Wells, and I wanted to just give a brief description of it, but then allow you to kind of expand on it.
Okay.
In your column, you had mentioned that you had argued that the best way to honor Ida would be to reduce the city's murder rate, basically. And, while she advocated for Black people to, look out for each other for sure, it was hard for me to see the direct correlation that you were trying to, put together. So can you explain a little bit more?
Sure. The one thing that Ida B. Wells spent her time on here and while she was here in Memphis and beyond was to reduce and expose the violence that was going on against Black people. That was really what ran her out of town, was to shine the light on people who were committing violent acts against African Americans, especially her three friends, as I mentioned earlier, the people who owned the People's Grocery. And so my thought was, we were right in the middle of a week-long celebration, commemoration of Ida B. Wells's life, while at the same time we had just unspeakable violence going on against Black people today here in the city. I mean, you had a young, I think he was a 7-year-old child who on the 4th of July, he was just out watching the fireworks, and people came along and started shooting and killed him. You had other acts of violence that have been going on in this city. Most of it involves African Americans. Just this past weekend, you had some guy, shooting inside the Incredible Pizza out here where I live. You had another incident and at apartments where somebody was shot. I mean, violence is up in the city this year, and the murder rate is up again this year. And we are on track to even break last year's record, which produced a record number of homicides. So I guess when I'm looking at, we're paying homage and we're remembering the life of someone who fought against violence against African Americans. The least we can do right now in 2021 is to try to stop the violence that African Americans in most cases are inflicting on themselves. And that's why I wrote it the way I did. I could have easily just written a column that said, isn't it wonderful that we're recognizing Ida B. Wells, she deserves it. And I did say that on television, but I wanted to go a little deeper and say, well, what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is put down your guns and stop thinking that a gun can solve everything. And don't go into a place like Incredible Pizza with a gun and start shooting because there are children in there. And so that was my motivation for doing that. Here's a woman who stood against violence. So the least we can do today is stand up against violence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, yeah, that's helpful framing. And I'm curious too, if in when you were sitting down and thinking about that, because a lot of times, as we in this world that we live in, and so many people advocating against equality and eliminating racism often use urban violence as a way to kind of dismiss calls for justice.
I agree.
Did that kind of play into your consideration there too?
Well, I thought about that, yes, and I'm certainly one of those who I've written a lot about racial injustice. I've written a lot about police brutality, and I can't tell you how many columns I've written and included the names George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and and also Derek Chauvin and the just the pretty much the lynching that he did in front of a person with a cell phone. But I'm able to also see that we have to also, as we do that, we also need to work on reducing the violence in our own backyards. And that doesn't negate, and it should never negate the lack of equal justice and the lack of the ability of someone to be free from harassment by the police, or the lack or the racial profiling that goes on. That I'm not going to dismiss an act of racial profiling just because a black person shot another black person in South Memphis last night. That doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about over here. And anybody who tries to conflate those, they don't want to talk about the injustices against black people. Well, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to let people, as far as I can, if I can help it, I'm not going to let you dismiss the true acts of injustice, because yes, the murder rate is up here in Memphis. We can work on both of those things. We can do both of them at the same time. As the old cliche says, we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
And speaking of, just about systemic racism, you've also been writing about how, multiple states have pushed to ban critical race theory from classrooms. What do you think that will mean in how we teach about Ida B. Wells and, the consequences of that? Maybe not just Ida B. Wells, but, even from your own story, talking about how, in my own story too, of already there seems to be a lot of lack of care about Black history, about racism, and so I was curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, Laura, I really do hope that a lot of teachers, a lot of principals, guidance counselors, school board members, school administrators, wherever you are, I really hope, if you're in a state that has sought to outlaw what critical race theory, and I'm putting it in quotes because they don't even know what it means. I'm talking about the lawmakers. They don't know what they're talking about. I would hope that they ignore that and do what they are supposed to do to teach kids about the truth about American history, and just ignore all of that. I did write a column several weeks ago in which I had a conversation. I sat down with a white state representative, Mark White, and tried to understand, because he's chair of the House Education Administration Committee, and his committee was the one that rushed through that ban on teaching quote unquote critical race theory in public schools. And because I wanted to be fair to him, and I've known him for several years, and we've gotten along. We've been technically friends, as much as a journalist can be a friend to anybody. And I wrote a column about that, and I gave him his say on that. But at the end, I said, this is ridiculous, really. What you're doing here is you're putting a chilling effect on teaching anything about systemic and institutional racism. And these teachers are not going to understand, well, what is my limit here? And they're just going to wind up not teaching anything about African-American history and the hardships that people like Ida B. Wells went through, or even the Otis Sanford went through when I was going to college, and how I was a victim of institutional racism as a Black journalism student in the early 1970s. You're telling teachers, stay away from that, because you're teaching you're going to, if there are white students in your class, you're going to make them feel guilty. And I'm saying, how ridiculous can that be? This is not about blaming anybody today, unless they do something that's blamable today. But I think it's appropriate to talk about the vestiges of racism, who benefited from it, who were hurt by it, and because that's information that's part of education in my mind. So again, I just think that for the most part, lawmakers don't even know what they're talking about when they talk about critical race theory. That's a concept that's really mostly taught and discussed in law school anyway. It's not even taught in elementary schools and middle schools and even high schools. So I just think it was much ado about nothing. It was something that the Republicans could use as a hot button issue to gin up their base and just find an issue that is not an issue in my mind. So I really do hope that teachers will just ignore it. I teach a class at the University of Memphis called Media Diversity in Society. And it's a class that gets into a lot of issues about how diversity impacts the media and in turn, how that impacts our society. And we talk a lot about race. We talk about systemic racism, especially in the media. We talk about, the early portrayals of African Americans on television and the portrayals of African Americans in the newspapers. When, back the commercial appeal would refuse to identify a Black woman as Miss or Mrs. They would always use her first name, but white women, they would call them Miss or Mrs. And the people from the NAACP went down and asked the editor, can you give us the same courtesy titles that others get? And he said no. And I think that journalism students, if you're talking about the history of media, they need to know that. They just need to know that, Laura. And shame on any politician somewhere who don't want certain students, and I'm saying white students here, don't want them to know about the history of institutional and systemic racism in America. Is just a shame. And so that's my take on this. And I'm going to keep writing about it because I just think it was just wrong for them to do that without even having so much as a hearing and bringing in people from the education community, principals and administrators to talk about, well, what are you teaching? They didn't even ask. They did this in 2 or 3 days and passed a bill that says you can't teach this kind of stuff in schools. And now the teachers don't even know what they can teach. That's my position on it.
Mm-hmm. And to take it one step further, when you're talking about, the consequences of that, I think even people in my generation think a lot about like, oh, well, when it comes to racism and how it's manifested in each generation, it just will naturally die out, and I just don't think that's true. Like every generation has to understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. It's a constant battle. It's not something that just magically will disappear because other generations die out, and that, obviously ties into what we teach in classrooms. So
absolutely.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I have one more question before we go to Q&A. So everyone else, while I'm doing this, we have a few questions already, but you can be thinking of those and put that in the Q&A. But another aspect of Ida's legacy, especially when she was in Chicago, was caring for folks as they migrated from the South to Chicago,
Right.
and were having a hard time getting established. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that your wife, the Reverend Dr. Elaine Sanford, founded a whole ministry, providing services to address poverty. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. Yes, she runs a ministry called Her Faith Ministry. It is a ministry that is devoted to helping people who are impoverished in this community. When we started out, more than 10 years ago now, it's more like 13 years, we had some houses that we had that we could put people, give people shelter, not for a short period of time, but as long as they needed to be there to try to get back on their feet. We sort of transition out of the housing part of it now, and we just help people with whatever their needs are. We did just today. I was kind of worried that I wouldn't get back here in time to be on the Zoom webinar today, because she was helping a young lady who was having some domestic trouble. She's very advanced in a pregnancy. Didn't have any money, didn't have anywhere to go. And so the ministry has put her up in a hotel for about a week until she can figure out, working with other members of her family about what she can do after that. That's just one of the things that this ministry does. It provides transportation for people who need transportation to get to a job and they don't have it. I'm talking about public transportation. It provides transportation to take people to get medical treatment if they need that. They provide clothing, they provide food for people who are in need. Poverty is a really, really big issue in this community. Our poverty rate continues to hover around the mid 20%. It has gotten as high as almost 30% in this community prior. And so Elaine has made it her mission and calling to try to do what she can to help those in poverty in this community. And it's a godly work, and I admire her for doing it. And I help out when I can.
Well, yeah, and it speaks to kind of the micro and macro parts of combating racism and its effects.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's, Ida B. Wells was very obviously vocal on the macro level of we need policies to be changed and, how laws are written, that sort of thing. But also she was very involved on, just the street level, helping people out with the problems that they have right now that, even if a law is passed, isn't going to help them until, much later. So I think that's something else that we can all learn from, of working on both ends. Absolutely.
And to your point about what she was doing in Chicago, she sometimes even got into disagreements with other African Americans in Chicago who did not necessarily welcome the African Americans who were coming from the South, especially coming from plantations and trying to find a better life on the South side of Chicago, for example. And so she had some battles with some people up there because she felt like we need to be more welcoming. I know what the situation is back South because I lived it, and I'm going to do what I can to help those. And those who were born and raised in Chicago thought that they were better than the ones who were coming from the South. And so she had some battles about that. Yes, that's just another part of her life that people should really be proud of, that she helped people in all walks of life and tried to do what she could to help.
And another thing that I learned from that documentary, speaking of that, was they had even created a whole club, I guess, for lack of a better word, of Black Chicagoans who could prove that their family had been there at least 30 years because they wanted to separate themselves from who they consider to be ruffians, coming up from the South. And I at that part, I was like, that is just so petty.
It is.
but
it is.
but like also at the same time, but we see that at play today, when it comes to people who forget what it's like coming up, and there can be similar tensions between middle class Black folk and lower class Black folk. It's just there's a lot of lessons there to say we don't need to create a club.
Exactly. Right. We don't need to create a club, and we don't need these cliques, and we need to do what we can to help one another. And if you're a journalist, you certainly need to do what you can to help one another.
Yeah, and so 2 announcements before I go to the Q&A. We've mentioned a couple of times about the People's Grocery lynching that happened here in Memphis. One of the 25 cases that we've identified that represent, I believe, 36 or 37 people. And we just recently, in the past week or so, came out with a new podcast under the Lynching Sites Project called The Red Record, which is a nod to Ida B. Wells's documenting of lynchings and sharing the victims' stories and what really happened. And so our first episode is going deep into the People's Grocery lynching. And right now you can find that podcast on Spotify and Google Podcasts. And I'm going to go ahead and peek into the Q&A here. And actually the first question from Mr. Pope actually reminds me also, for those who are interested in learning more about Ida B. Wells, of course, there's Ida B. Wells Plaza, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Ida B. Wells Museum in Holly Springs, which is where she was born. That museum is the property where she was born. It's been around for years and only, less than an hour drive from Memphis. So you guys can check that out. It's idabwellsmuseum.org and schedule a tour by calling the museum. And let's see. Well, our question from Mary Olson we had addressed regarding critical race theory. So it's great that you were thinking about that.
Right.
Mr. Pope is asking, there were prominent in Holly Springs and around West College. Do you know if there are relatives there? I guess in Holly Springs, I guess he's referring to a Blanche Bruce or where he was from.
Right. I'm not sure, and I would kind of doubt it. Blanche Bruce did not grow up, I don't think, in Mississippi. I think he grew up somewhere up north and migrated to Mississippi just as Hiram Rebels did. And again, Blanche Bruce was the second African-American ever to serve in the U.S. Senate in Mississippi. He served from 1875, I think, to 1881, but I'm not aware that he has any relatives in North Mississippi, and certainly not in the Holly Springs area. But again, Blanche Bruce is someone who gets totally ignored when we talk about history, but he's the second ever Black person to serve in the U.S. Senate.
And we also have a question about where to see the documentary, and I don't see where I can put it in the chat, but if you guys look up, just PBS Chicago, Ida B. Wells documentary, it'll come up. And like I said, it's about an hour long, really worth your time. And let's see here from Mr. Creech, we have, as journalists with the increase of online news sources and social media, what might your thoughts be on how to best get stories out to the public and keep the confidence of the public?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, primarily because social media has been, for lack of a better term, sort of hijacked by people who want to say any and everything and couch it in information and accurate information. And most of the time it's not. I think social media is a good repository for rumors and I hate to use this term, but it is a term, fake news. If people use that. I think that it is still important for anybody, and I tell my students this all the time, you need to know the source of your information. And there's still, no matter what you think about either the New York Times or the Washington Post or the local news organizations here, you may think that they may have done you wrong in the past. They are still reputable news sources. And so when I'm looking online for information, I always check the source. And I determine if it is a reputable source, someone who mostly a legacy journalism organization, or certainly an organization that I have grown to trust, even if it's a new one. Chalkbeat is relatively new, but it is certainly a reputable journalism organization because they do good reporting, especially on education. So I just think it's important that we know the source of the information and take a lot of what you see on social media with a grain of salt. And if it's not from somebody reputable, I would pretty much ignore it.
And we have a question from Alicia, writing from Richmond, VA, which is great. I used to live there before I moved to Memphis. So shout out our VA. She says, can you talk about any experiences with cultural appropriation from white-led organizations and or gatekeepers within the Black community in reclaiming any of this history? You just spoke on this a bit. Thank you for this talk.
Okay, I'm looking at this too, about any experiences with cultural appropriation from white-led organizations and or gatekeepers within the Black community. I'm not sure.
I think especially in talking about how we share history and like she said, reclaiming history.
I see, okay. I don't know that there's anything else I can add other than what I've said earlier. When I look at the word appropriation here in this, I guess one of the things that come to mind is Beale Street itself and the history of Beale Street. And there has been some criticism in the past that white organizations and white business leaders had tried to sort of appropriate the history of Beale Street, for example, and maybe ignore the legacy of that place being a mecca for Black entrepreneurship and Black entertainment going all the way back to the 1800s. So I do think about that when I hear that word. Again, I just say overall, it is important that the history of racism, the trials and toils of African Americans in this country, in building this country, they have to be told, and they should be a part of the normal course of history. We shouldn't just wait till the month of February and talk about what Black people have done. It is something that needs to be a part of curricula all the way, all year round. And so I guess that may not answer that particular question, but that's, again, when I see appropriation, that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
And I would add to, I guess, from my newly entering into the public history museum kind of field, there's a lot of conversations going on about how to, because I mean, at its core, museums and how we tell history are not neutral. Like all of it, it comes from a point of view. How you shape things, is by nature objective or subjective. And right. And so thinking about how to be collaborative and how we share stories, and I learned this too as a journalist, that giving it's not just about quote unquote giving people their voice. They have a voice, but they don't have a platform to share a lot of times, or that platform has been taken away from them. And I think the similarities in the museum and journalism field, that sharing these stories, cannot ignore those who it's about. If it's not done collaboratively, whether that's by, like you said, gatekeepers in the Black community or white-led organizations, and it's not going to be the truth, and it's not going to be fully accurate. So just approaching it from that, as opposed to just kind of, this is the hot thing right now to talk about Black history,
Oh, I see. Okay.
But approaching it from a way of, this is important to our future, and doing that collaboratively. So
I got that. And to that point very quickly, and this may come across as a little bit of a shameless plug, but I think it ties into what you just said. Tom mentioned my second book when he was introducing me, the In a Colorful Place book that I wrote with Dan Conaway. That was actually my second book. The first one was a book about the political history of Memphis from the perspective of African Americans. It's called From Boss Crump to King Willie, How Race Changed Memphis Politics. And I think the reason that I'm bringing it up within the context of what you just said, Laura, is because up to that point, in terms of that kind of political history, from the rise of Boss Crump all the way to the election of the first African-American mayor, that story really had not been told. And it certainly had not been told by an African-American writer. We've had some outstanding African-American historians in the city who have done some really great work. Miriam DaCosta Willis is one of them. She's my hero. I miss her to this day. So I think the story has to be told from a viewpoint of someone who has lived some of that. And I lived some of that in the Boss Crump book, because I was a young reporter here in the 1970s, and I covered politics in the 1970s and 80s, and I'm familiar with the rise of Harold Ford, for example, and the Ford family political dominance, and the beginnings of Willie Harrington when he became the superintendent of city schools. So I was able to connect those dots doing research, because it was all about research for Boss Crump. There's nobody alive now for him. But the people who were around in the 70s, 60s, even 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of them are still around, and so was I. And so I could tell that story. So I do understand what you're saying about the necessity for having a diversity of voices telling those stories.
We have one more question from Rich Watkins, who is the co-host for Lynching Sites Project's new podcast. Okay. He said, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you change about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which I may not be familiar with, but I think he's about to explain it. Social media providers benefit greatly from it because they cannot be held liable for the things that people post, unlike publishers of newspapers.
Yeah. And I do have a problem with that because I do think that social media sites, they make a ton of money, and they have made a ton of money. They are one of the most dominating, among the most dominating companies in America today. Facebook is really at the top of the list. I teach that in one of my classes. I do think that there should be more responsibility on them to police their sites better. Newspapers traditionally were responsible for the things that they allowed to be published in their newspapers, including letters to the editor. And that was a perfect place to say, well, I'm not writing it, so I don't. No, the newspapers did not abdicate their responsibility, even with a letter to the editor. They checked some of that out. And if it turned out to be false, they wouldn't run the letter. Now it could be opinion that, it's hard to check the truth or the falsity of it, and they may run that. But newspapers have much more of a responsibility and have accepted a greater responsibility to make sure what's in their newspaper is accurate, including ads. And so I think it's incumbent upon social media companies to do the same thing. I think we may be a little too late to get that done because they have grown to be so big, and it's hard to go back and try to put restrictions on them right now. And most people would say, well, I don't want the government dictating that kind of thing anyway. So that it may be difficult to do, but I do think that they should voluntarily take on even more responsibility than they do right now. They claim that they do to some degree, but I don't think they do enough of it.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison of talking about letters to the editor, because I think that's like probably the closest correlation that you'll have. But it wasn't just like baseless stuff could just run rampant. And I think part of the trouble too is that, especially in the beginning, I don't think Facebook, Twitter, etc., were thinking that they would be the center of public discourse. And essentially gatekeepers of a lot of information. Just wasn't envisioned as that, and it just kind of grew into that.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of it becomes incumbent on the consumer of that to what we would call media literacy, being able to spot disinformation and check sources and know what red flags there are. And there are great, tools and resources out there on how to do that. So I think at this point, it's probably just going to be incumbent on all of us to check each other when it comes to what we consume and what we deem or, how we look at that. So
absolutely, it is. We have to all do it ourselves and be a check and balance ourselves on that kind of information. I agree.
Well, thank you so much. This was really great. I had a lot of fun, and I hope you did too.
I did.
And for everyone that joined us, thanks for being here. Be sure to just, if you've not already signed up for our newsletter, make sure that you sign up for that. And check. So if you're signed up for that, check your email for when our next event will be, or you can follow us on Facebook, all the things. But thank you all for being with us, and we'll go ahead and close out.
All right. Thank you, Laura. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good evening.
All right. You too.